There's a specific, frustrating experience a lot of people know intimately, actively not wanting to think about someone and thinking about them anyway. Not during quiet, obviously vulnerable moments, but in the middle of a work meeting, while brushing your teeth, in the 3 seconds between finishing one task and starting the next. The thought arrives uninvited, sometimes years after the relationship or the person in question stopped being part of daily life, and the sheer persistence of it can feel almost insulting, as though some part of the mind simply refuses to take direction from the rest of it. Here's what makes this particularly confusing for a lot of people. The thinking often isn't accompanied by any conscious desire to still care. Someone might genuinely want to be over a person, might even recognize clearly that the relationship wasn't good for them, and still find that person occupying mental space with a persistence that seems to have nothing to do with what they actually want. This creates a strange kind of internal conflict, wanting the thoughts to stop, and the wanting itself seeming to make almost no difference at all. So today we're going to look at why this happens, and the answer turns out to have less to do with unresolved feelings in the romantic sense than most people assume, and more to do with how memory, attention, and unfinished business actually work inside the brain. It's worth naming, before going further, why this experience produces so much private confusion and self-judgment. There's a common assumption that if a thought about someone keeps returning, it must mean something significant, that some part of you still wants them, still needs them, hasn't truly let go. This assumption treats the frequency of a thought as though it were a direct, reliable measure of its meaning, when frequency and meaning turn out to be governed by fairly different psychological systems. A thought can recur constantly for purely mechanical reasons, an unresolved question, a conditioned cue, a neurochemical adjustment still in progress, without carrying anywhere near the significance its persistence seems to suggest. Let's start with a piece of research that's become foundational to understanding this exact phenomenon: the Zeigarnik effect, named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who in the 1920s noticed something curious while observing waiters in a Vienna cafe. Waiters could recall the details of orders that hadn't yet been paid for with remarkable precision, but forgot those same details almost immediately once the bill was settled. Zeigarnik went on to demonstrate this formally in controlled studies, finding that people remember interrupted or incomplete tasks considerably better than completed ones. The mind, it turns out, holds onto unfinished business with a kind of active tension that resolved business simply doesn't generate. Relationships that end abruptly, ambiguously, or without a clear, mutually understood conclusion function, psychologically, almost exactly like an unfinished task. A relationship that ended with clear communication, an honest conversation, a shared understanding of why things didn't work, tends to get filed away by the mind as resolved, complete, no longer requiring active processing. A relationship that ended through ghosting, through a fight that was never actually settled, through a slow fade with no real closure, or even one that ended clearly but left significant unanswered questions, tends to remain open in a very literal cognitive sense, and the mind keeps returning to it periodically, the same way it would keep returning to an unfinished task it hasn't been allowed to complete. This explains something that confuses a lot of people about which relationships tend to linger longest in memory. It's very often not the healthiest, most fulfilling relationships that produce the most persistent thinking. It's the most unresolved ones, the situationship that never got a real conversation about what it was, the ex who left without explanation, the friendship that ended in a misunderstanding neither person ever cleared up. The intensity of ongoing thought correlates far more strongly with how unfinished something feels than with how good or healthy it actually was. There's a second mechanism worth understanding, and it directly explains the frustrating experience of actively trying not to think about someone and having that effort backfire. Psychologist Daniel Wegner's research on thought suppression, sometimes summarized through what's called the white bear experiment, found that instructing people not to think about a specific thing, in his original study, literally a white bear, reliably produced more thoughts about that exact thing, not fewer. Wegner called this ironic process theory. The mental process responsible for monitoring whether a suppressed thought is intruding has to keep checking for that thought in order to suppress it, which means the very act of suppression requires holding the thought in mind, at least briefly, over and over again. Applied to thinking about a person you're trying to stop thinking about, this explains a specific, maddening loop. The harder someone tries to push a thought away, the more frequently a background process has to check in on that exact thought in order to keep suppressing it, which paradoxically increases its frequency rather than decreasing it. This is part of why simply trying harder to stop thinking about someone so often fails, and why people often report the thoughts intensifying specifically during periods when they're most actively trying to move on. There's a third layer worth adding, related to classical conditioning. The same basic learning mechanism most people first encounter through Pavlov's dogs. A meaningful relationship, over time, becomes associated with an enormous number of ordinary cues, specific songs, certain smells, particular routes through a city, times of day, even unrelated emotional states like stress or loneliness that happen to co-occur frequently with that person during the relationship. Once a relationship ends, those cues don't disappear. They remain, scattered throughout ordinary daily life, each one capable of triggering a thought about the person almost instantly, regardless of how much conscious progress has otherwise been made. This is why thinking about someone often spikes unpredictably, not because anything has changed internally, but because an external cue, a song on the radio, a street corner, an offhand comment from a friend, activated an association that was built, sometimes over years, and that doesn't erode nearly as quickly as most people expect it to. A fourth mechanism, worth naming because it often gets confused with genuinely missing someone, involves the neurochemistry of attachment itself. Research using functional imaging, notably work by biological anthropologist Helen Fisher and colleagues, has found that early-stage romantic attachment activates brain regions associated with reward and craving, some of the same circuitry implicated in substance dependence. When a relationship ends, particularly one that was emotionally intense, the brain doesn't simply switch this circuitry off. It continues for a period, generating a craving response remarkably similar to withdrawal, which can produce persistent thoughts about a person that feel like longing, but that are at a mechanistic level, closer to a neurochemical adjustment process working itself out over time, similar to what happens when any strong, reliable source of reward is suddenly removed. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't mean. None of these mechanisms suggest the feelings involved aren't real or that the relationship itself didn't matter. What they suggest is that the persistence of thinking about someone isn't necessarily evidence of unresolved romantic feelings in the way it's often interpreted to be.
Sometimes it is exactly that.
But very often, it's the Zeigarnik effect responding to genuine unfinished business, ironic process theory responding to the effort of suppression itself, classical conditioning responding to scattered environmental cues, or a neurochemical withdrawal process working through its natural timeline, none of which require an actual ongoing desire to be with that person in order to keep generating thoughts about them. Consider a composite example. Someone will call Alina, who ended a 2-year relationship that had, by her own account, run its course amicably enough. No dramatic betrayal, no unresolved fight, simply 2 people who had grown in different directions. Alina expected the thinking to fade relatively quickly, given how clean the ending had been, and was genuinely confused when, 8 months later, she still found herself thinking about her ex multiple times a week, often triggered by nothing she could identify, a particular intersection near her old apartment, a specific kind of overcast morning. What Alina eventually recognized, with some help from a therapist, was that the relationship's ending had felt clean on the surface, but had left one specific piece of unfinished business underneath. A conversation about whether they might have worked if the timing had been different, a question neither of them had ever actually addressed directly. both preferring to let the relationship end on amicable terms rather than risk reopening something painful. That single unaddressed question turned out to be functioning almost exactly like Zeigarnik's unpaid bill, a small piece of genuinely unfinished business, quietly keeping the entire relationship more cognitively active than its otherwise clean ending would have predicted. It's worth adding a second example because not every case of persistent thinking traces back to unfinished business in the way Alina's did. Consider someone we'll call Tomas, whose relationship had ended over a year earlier, definitively and for reasons he understood clearly and had made peace with. What confused Tomas wasn't lingering feeling for his ex specifically. He was genuinely, verifiably over the relationship in every way he could measure. What persisted instead was a specific set of triggers, a particular coffee shop they'd frequented together, a certain time of year that matched when they'd first started dating, a mutual friend's social media posts that occasionally surfaced old photos. Each of these cues reliably produced a brief, vivid memory and a corresponding wave of thought, disproportionate to how little he actually missed the relationship itself. Tomas's case is a clean illustration of classical conditioning operating largely on its own, without much genuine, unfinished business underneath it. The relationship had ended cleanly. What hadn't happened yet was the gradual, passive process of those specific cues losing their associative power through reduced exposure and time. Once Tomas recognized this distinction, that his thoughts were being generated by conditioning rather than by any actual desire to reconnect, he found it considerably easier to tolerate the occasional spike of memory without reading deep significance into it, treating each instance as an old, weakening association firing rather than as evidence his feelings were more unresolved than he believed. So, what actually helps here? Given that willpower alone, as Wegner's research demonstrates, tends to backfire. The first practical tool involves deliberately scheduling time to think about the person, rather than trying to eliminate the thoughts entirely. This sounds counterintuitive, but it directly addresses ironic process theory. Setting aside a specific, contained window, 10 minutes in the evening, to consciously think through the relationship removes the pressure from the rest of the day to suppress the thought at every other moment, since the mind now has a designated time. It knows the thought will get its due attention. Many people find that thoughts occurring outside that window become easier to set aside once they know there's a legitimate place for them later. The second tool involves directly addressing genuine, unfinished business where possible, rather than assuming time alone will resolve it. This doesn't always mean contacting the person, which isn't appropriate or helpful in every situation. Sometimes it means writing an unsent letter that articulates the unanswered question directly, giving the mind a concrete sense of completion even without external resolution. Sometimes it means having a single, deliberate conversation with a trusted friend or a therapist specifically about what feels unresolved, naming it explicitly rather than letting it remain a vague, unprocessed background hum. A third tool involves identifying and gradually addressing the specific conditioned cues that keep triggering thoughts, rather than being surprised anew each time one fires. This might mean noticing that a particular song reliably triggers thinking about the person and consciously choosing, for a period, to avoid or limit exposure to it, not indefinitely, but long enough for the association to weaken naturally through simple lack of reinforcement. Over time, with reduced exposure, most conditioned associations do fade, though the timeline varies considerably depending on how deeply embedded a particular cue became during the relationship itself. A fourth tool involves recognizing the neurochemical craving pattern for what it is, particularly in the early months after significant relationship ends, and treating it with the same patience one might extend to any other withdrawal process, rather than interpreting every spike in longing as proof that the relationship should be revisited. This distinction matters considerably. A craving response and a genuinely good reason to reconnect are not the same thing, even though they can feel remarkably similar from the inside, And confusing the two is part of what leads people back into relationships that ended for good reasons, mistaking neurochemical withdrawal for renewed compatibility. A fifth tool involves simple patience with the specific, uneven timeline this process tends to follow. Persistent thinking about someone rarely fades in a smooth, linear decline. It tends to decrease overall while still producing occasional, sometimes intense spikes, often triggered by an anniversary, an unexpected cue, or a period of stress that happens to lower general emotional resilience.